Okay, great. So hello, I'm Danny Galvis from the University of Birmingham, and I'm going to be speaking to you a little bit today about the interactions between stress and inflammation during surgery, in particular heart surgery. So first, I'd like to thank all my collaborators, Jamie Walker, Ben Gibson, who's the clinician who collected the data, and Eder Zavala. And we're also working with an artist, Pietro Bardini, who's going to show us a little bit about how interactions in the body can be represented using music. So the majority of people who undergo a heart surgery are well enough to leave the hospital after just a couple of days. But about 1 in 4 people aren't so lucky. They will end up needing to stay in intensive care for several days or even weeks. And this is generally due to persistent inflammation in the body. So it's not just sort of the swelling that you would get near the cut, but also it can go throughout the whole body, and that becomes quite a problem. And so what we want to do is better understand the causes of this and eventually to guide preventative measures to improve outcomes. So heart surgery, or really any surgery, is a very surprising procedure for the body to go through. The body recognizes the surgery as a problem in the short term and activates 2 processes in an effort to protect itself. These are stress and inflammation. So inflammation occurs anytime you get a bump or a bruise, causes swelling around the injury, and protects the area from further damage. Stress, on the other hand, is like your fight or flight response that can occur when your body senses a danger or when you have to give a talk. But both of these processes are necessary for the body to protect itself, but in some cases, the body doesn't recognize when it needs to shut them down. So this can eventually cause it to start damaging itself, and so it needs to be very carefully monitored. So what we want to do is better understand how stress and inflammation interact with each other. We know that stress hormones reduce inflammation, but we don't know how exactly. And we also know that chemicals released during inflammation, these are called cytokines, can mobilize your stress response. So we're trying to work on better understanding these interactions and why they can sometimes lead to persistent stress. And I should note that stress being a good thing can be a bit counterintuitive, but it does protect you from things like big dogs. There. Okay. Yeah, so the hormones ACTH and cortisol are the primary signals of stress in the body. And these hormones, they wax and wane over the course of the day when a person's not undergoing any real stress. So this top right picture sort of shows what that looks like when something sort of stressful. Oh no, it happened again. Sorry. Very quickly. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Somebody. Okay. Yeah. Really sorry about that. PowerPoint is acting up for me. Swap displays. Okay. Yeah. So it waxes and wanes throughout the day, and you can kind of see this in the top right. So you can kind of see that it's sort of high in the early hours of the day, and then it's a little bit lower later in the day. And this is a completely normal thing to happen. But after a surgery, it becomes quite a bit different, the behavior. So before this black line, you can kind of see things are sort of low. The inflammation should be near 0. And then during the surgery, everything kind of goes very high. So you have a high stress response and a high inflammatory response. And over time, so it's about 12 hours, things start to decrease again, go back to normal, and it takes a couple days usually. So what we're doing is putting together a mathematical model to show how the hormones involved in stress sort of slow down inflammation and the ways in which the inflammatory response acts on stress. And this is our big question. So we're doing this in about 10 people who have undergone heart surgery. And in the future, we'd like to use this model to better understand what are the conditions under which someone will have a more persistent inflammation and stress, and then propose interventions to protect people from it. So with that, I'll pass you to Pietro, who's going to show us a little bit about how these rhythms in the body can be represented through music and sound.
Sorry, Pietro, you're on mute. Sorry, folks. Hopefully Pietro can sort out his audio problems.
This was a deliberate thing, wasn't it, to have a sound engineer have an audio problem, right?
Hello?
Here we go.
Perfect. There we go.
Great.
Back online.
Okay, sorry about that. Start again. Thank you very much, Danny, for the introduction. So I introduce myself again. I'm Pietro. I'm an artist, work with sound and computation. And for this residency, the work I produced is a sound composition for 5 channels, which means 5 distinctive output, 5 speakers. They use as a blueprint the relationships that Danny just showed in his research. What I wanted to achieve with this piece was to create a self-sustaining composition that would move out from more linear approaches to sound composition. What you can see here is the score of the piece in a way, and I'm going to go through it with you to explain how everything works. So the piece is called Cycles of Healing because the structure of the piece itself is made out of endless repetition of a compositional cycle. And as I said, it's for 5 voices or 5 channels. And as you can see here in the first slide, the first 2 voices are the hormones that Danny showed us, and voice 3 and voice 4 are the inflammatory mediators, while voice 5 represents the overall inflammation. And in this graph here, you can see how a compositional cycle develops, and is composed of 2 main sections, rest phase and an operation phase. During the rest phase, we can see that there are only 2 waves. This is because only 2 voices or 2 channels will be playing, and these 2 are the hormones. When the operation begins, the ACTH and CORT drop in amplitude and in frequency, and this allows for the inflammatory mediators IL-6 and TNF-alpha to rise as well. And this brings the inflammation level as well, until they reach a point of total inflammation or instability, to then go back to normality. So the system sort of heals itself. And each composition cycle is slightly different from one another because it sort of represents a virtual patient. So as a different response to the operation, it's got a different inflammation response as a result. At the end of the rest phase and before the operation phase begins, I introduced this, I call the probability of success. So to give a bit more variety change to the piece. And in 85% of the cases, this is like just a random function, 85% of the cases will have a positive response and will go through the operation phase that I just showed you. 15% of the times, I've called abnormal response of negative response, which will bring the sort of death of the composition, but I'll go through that later. First, I explain how the operation sort of unfolds. And what happens during an operation phase is sort of essentially the system goes from a state of instability or being out of tune to a state of harmony. where the system has healed itself. And this healing process happens on two levels in this composition, on an harmonic level and on an amplitude level. And the way it works is through an impulse. And if you can see my cursor here, this impulse move following these arrows. So it first goes through these inflammatory mediators, and then through the hormones, ACTH and CORT, and then to the inflammation. Then it goes back to the TNF-alpha, so the inflammatory mediator. It keeps repeating this cycle until the inflammation is down to zero, so it's in complete harmony. And when I talk about harmony, I mean that at the beginning of each cycle, these three voices, so TNF-alpha, IL-6, and the inflammation, are very out of tune with this harmonic axis. And the harmonic axis is played by the cortisol and ACTH. So the two hormones represent the harmonic axis, and this inflammatory mediator, they sort of try to tune in as they heal themselves. And we can see that in this, with this dotted line. So we start from being out of tune to more in tune. And however, this voice here has a slightly different behavior because it's regulated by another internal feedback between the CORT and the TNF-alpha. This straight line here, this curve, sorry, this curve here, the not dotted, shows a bit the curve of amplitude of these voices. As I said, once the operation phase begins, this CORT and ACTH, they drop in amplitude, so they become quieter. And this allows for these two voices to go in amplitude, but they become louder, which as a result bring the inflammation voice loud as well. And this, yeah, this ends how the operation works. So going from inflammation, very out of tune, to in tune, in unison with this harmonic axis. However, as I said, there could be an abnormal response. In this case, all the voices, they rise in amplitude, they rise in frequency, they are very out of tune until they reach an halting point, where it represents a sort of the death of the system in a way. And after that, there's a period of silence, and then it goes back to the rest phase that I showed earlier. And with this matrix, we can see a bit better how what happens. These are just random operation cycle that I exported and to see what happened. So during the first operation cycle, or the first compositional cycle, we have a positive response. So we go ahead with the operation, and then we get an inflammation level. So each operation cycle has a different inflammation level that goes between 60 and 100. 60 being not inflamed or just a small inflammation, 100 being very, very inflamed. In this case, we have 90, so it's quite inflamed. And then we have an ACTH response, and this dictates how well the system will behave to the inflammation. So if we have if we get a good value, so 10, it responds very well. 1, it's not going to respond very well. It's going to take longer for the system to heal itself. In this case, this 5 is quite inflamed, so it takes 3 minutes and 63 seconds to complete a composition cycle of the operation. For instance, another very different case is number 10. The system is not very inflamed, 61, it's got a good ACTH response. It only takes 1 minute and 41 seconds to complete the operation phase and go back to the rest phase. This graph shows how the speakers will be placed in the space. So unfortunately now it's just virtual, so it can't be experienced fully. But once things are less restricted, we can have these in a space. This is how the speakers will be placed in the space to sort of further highlight the relationship between these voices. At the center, we have the two hormones that they'll be facing each other. And this outer triangle has the inflammatory mediators, and this is the inflammation voice. The sounds made using two techniques. The outer triangle uses physical modeling, which sort of try to reproduce how membranes or surfaces vibrate in real life through algorithms. So you can get these very clean, crisp sounds. While the two center voice, they are more of a drone type of sound, distended larger sound, which is made through a phase vocoder, which distend my recordings. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pietro. That was amazing. There's so many